Just, yep. Just send it to Louis. Just try again with just Louis. Are you on a photo? Councillors, are we ready? Right. I think we better start. Thanks, Hugo.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We've got some slides here which we'll run through reasonably quickly. I'm Hugo Ellis. I'm from Cameron Partners, a partner at Cameron Partners. I'm here with my colleagues Paul Doherty and Daniela Bassard. Rob Cameron also sends his apologies. He's got some medical treatment today which he couldn't transfer. Perhaps I can just introduce Cameron Partners for those who don't know us. We're a New Zealand investment bank owned by the partners.
Can we pull the microphone a bit closer, please?
Apologies. We advise on a range of transactions, mergers and acquisitions, capital raisings, and provide corporate finance advice. We've got a great deal of experience advising local government. We led the establishment of the Local Government Funding Agency back in 2010 and 2011. We've advised Wellington Regional Council, Christchurch City Council, Local Government New Zealand, and Waterfront Auckland. And obviously, most recently, we've prepared a report, or undertaken a review and prepared a report for Auckland Council on its alternative financing sources. I think it's probably worthwhile highlighting a few key things from our report. The first of those is that the report or the review hasn't been undertaken in response to a funding or a financing crisis. Auckland Council has a balanced long-term plan, so its revenues and its costs have been debated and agreed. Its debt levels are consistent with a very strong AA credit rating, and the CapEx spending that's part of that long-term plan is maximised within those constraints. So essentially there is a viable status quo position for Auckland Council. However, we think that the purpose of the review is to flush out whether the status quo is in fact the optimal position for the council. So effectively there's a desire to test the ability whether the capital plan can be accelerated or expanded. As everyone around the table knows, Auckland Council is growing at an incredible rate. It's growing by the size of Hamilton every 5 years, which is really quite mind-boggling when you think about the infrastructure requirements that means. And there's also significant catch-up investment required, so there's significant deferred maintenance which has been occurring over a lengthy period. As we've gone through the process, we've had extensive access to Auckland Council personnel, but we haven't talked with a wide range of other stakeholders due to the timeframes of the review itself, and so further development of the options is going to require a great deal more consultation. And as we've looked at the financing options, to be frank, there are numerous options. So our approach is to set out the broad choices with supporting analysis and decision frameworks to assist the council to efficiently identify and prioritise areas where it wishes to undertake further investigation. We think that the council should be thinking of these options as a menu. Some of those options won't be starters and can be dismissed quite quickly. Some will require further investigation. In terms of putting the frameworks together, what we're hoping to assist the council with is not to make ad hoc decisions on assets, but rather take a more systematic approach to the way it thinks about its financing options. And we haven't prepared an advocacy paper either. We're not recommending specific options. Those decisions are for the councillors around the table to make. But what we do is we provide recommendations on the decision frameworks and the processes that we think the council should follow. So as we've worked with local authorities over the years, we've developed a good understanding of the budgeting process that councils must go through. And the way we think about it is that there's 4 broad interrelated levers that local authorities have to meet their expenditure plans and balance the budgets. And these levers can be categorised as funding options and financing options. Financing options is how a local authority is ultimately going to pay for expenditure, and that's through raising external revenue and generating surpluses. And then financing is the way that local authorities raise the money to undertake that expenditure in the interim. Ultimately, all financing options are finite, or they're constrained by the funding position of the local authority. So in the long term, Auckland Council must ultimately raise more revenue if it wishes to spend more. What we're talking about and what the scope of the review was to look at financing options and not the funding options. So our focus has been on the financing options, and we have identified three broad categories of options that we look at, that we've looked at in the report, and that is there additional debt capacity? What value can be released from existing assets that Auckland Council owns, and what financing can be raised from alternative sources or partnership arrangements. But before we get into a brief summary of those three categories, we think it's worthwhile emphasising some of the key financing principles which go to the heart of the dilemma that all councils face when they're balancing their budgets. And the first one is that all financing options have drawbacks. Unfortunately, there's no free lunch. If a council wishes to increase debt or use debt-like instruments such as PPPs, that creates a financing cost and a principal sum that requires repayment. So it essentially requires additional funding. Selling assets loses the benefits, and they could be financial benefits in terms of dividends, or the public benefits that the council receives from owning those assets. And the second thing is that council must make choices. Auckland Council is capital constrained. It can't keep raising revenue from its ratepayers and from the public, and its financing options are finite. So the council can't retain the status quo and invest in additional infrastructure. So a decision to do one is a decision not to do the other. And councils need to explicitly consider the merits of one choice against the other, another choice. There's an opportunity cost, and doing nothing is still a decision. So if we look at the first of the financing options, it's around whether there's additional debt capacity for Auckland Council. And Auckland Council's debt capacity is ultimately constrained by a combination of the policies of the local government funding agency, its own internal policies, and the credit rating that the council wishes to maintain. And if we sort of cut through the chase, under the current arrangements, there's little additional debt capacity. The constraint that the council has is firstly put in place by the local government funding agency, which has a net debt to revenue ratio. And when the analysis is done on the forecasts, the crunch point comes in 2019, where the council expects to have 9.5 billion of debt and have 10.5 billion in debt capacity. So it's at that point it'll effectively have $1 billion in headroom. If the council wishes to increase the debt capacity, firstly it would have to, or it has a number of options. It could accept that it doesn't need $1 billion in additional debt capacity or headroom, and could decide to go with a lower amount. Secondly, it could renegotiate the financial covenants that it has with the local government funding agency. That's not particularly straightforward. It requires an ordinary resolution from the shareholders of the local government funding agency. It would invariably need to accept a lower credit rating and the consequences of a lower credit rating, and it would ultimately need to amend its own internal policies. In any event, if the council does decide that it wishes to raise additional debt capacity, it ultimately needs to fund that. There's interest payments that need to be made, and there's a principal that needs to be repaid as well. So there will be consequences of that additional debt. I'll pass over to Paul to talk about the other two categories.
Thanks, Hugo. Partnerships and alternative procurement is the second box of financing levers. We think about private sector or partnerships with the private sector in their widest sense. So basically any form of partnership with the private sector in regard to the construction and/or maintenance or of a public asset or service. There's a range of potential partners for these kind of activities, construction consortia, the Māori, Superfund, ACC, infrastructure investors. They all have different investment criteria, will all be looking for, all be willing to take different risks, looking for different levels of liquidity, different investment horizons, but the one thing they will all have in common is that they all be looking for a commercial return on any money that they put into any opportunity. So the implication of that, right, is that if the project that is being funded doesn't itself generate sufficient external revenues to provide that commercial return, then the council's going to be on the hook for providing that commercial return. And I think, to cut to the chase, if you're looking at increasing the amount of expenditure on infrastructure assets, the likelihood is that they themselves are not going to generate a commercial return based on external revenues without some significant changes in policies around road pricing and what have you. What that means is that most of the PPP structures and private partnership structures you'll be looking at will have a lot of debt-like implications for the council. Ultimately, you'll be creating an obligation to repay the commercial partners' financing over some period of time. That being said, private sector partnerships can still be very attractive. They present, in general, and they are always case specific, but generally they are regarded as having strong procurement benefits in terms of cost outcomes and strong risk transfer outcomes as well. We seem to be at a time in history where very low costs of capital are being sought from investors in public infrastructure. And the combination of those two factors means that a council can get better value by using private sector partnerships to construct large infrastructure assets than it can by borrowing on its own and self-constructing. So that's the one major advantage. The second major advantage is that, sort of unlike traditional debt products, because it's a sort of a private contract for debt, you can structure that particular debt arrangement and its repayment profile to suit the particular funding requirements or abilities of the council. So we certainly recommend that, given that there's something like $13.5 billion of infrastructure capex in the long-term plan, that further investigation of using the private sector as a financing tool is warranted. In a similar vein, outsourcing. We note in the report that the council in the field makes good use, strong use of outsourcing. AT, for example, outsources a lot of its road maintenance and road construction. Watercare outsources a lot of its maintenance activities. Parks and Recreation outsources a lot of its maintenance activities. So the council is actually a very strong user of outsourcing. The difference that we do note is that internal to the council offices functions, there is quite a relatively low level of outsourcing compared to corporates in New Zealand. And we think that that's an area where the council could look to use to a greater level of outsourcing, and there may be within that construct the ability to sell the underlying assets that are being used to provide the relevant internal service, such as IT or printing or fleet, and with the efficiency savings obtained, offsetting the funding cost of having those assets in the private hands. And just finally on this page, we also note that the council owns and occupies about $280 million of vanilla commercial office space. Compared to most corporates, and certainly corporates that would regard themselves as having a capital constraint, be quite rare for organisations to typically own these kind of generic property assets. We understand, based on our conversations, that that's mainly driven by the observation that rental rates are higher than your borrowing rate. And as we discussed later, we think using the borrowing rate as a threshold for asset ownership is at best misleading. Asset recycling, and We've used the term asset recycling here, not to avoid using the concept of asset sales, because asset sales is indeed one leg of the transaction, but it is done with a view that ultimately what we're trying to do here is raise finance to create other assets. So we are talking about exchanging one asset for another.
Exactly.
That's right.
We've looked at we've gone through at a relatively high level, trying to see where there was possibilities for the council to realise value in existing assets. We classified the existing council balance sheet into three broad categories. Infrastructure assets, essentially AT, water care and stormwater. Then the community assets of regional parks and the community facilities. And then what we call the commercial assets. And I know from the workshop last Monday that the inclusion of certain assets in certain categories controversy, but the reason for doing that was more to sort of align where we saw the ability to capture value from the different asset classes. As you'll see when we talk about it, in infrastructure, it's really about whether or not we can get cost savings out of the asset management plans. With community assets, it's about making sure that the council understands just the true value of the land and buildings that are being used to provide certain services, and testing alternative use value, and whether or not, in situations where there's high alternative use, the underlying service could be provided in a different way. And with the commercial assets, it's really just it's trying to test whether the council needs to own all or part of the underlying assets to provide or to ensure that the service is being provided. If I turn the page and look at infrastructure assets first, we're talking about 29 odd billion worth of assets here. It's the lion's share of the Auckland balance sheet. CapEx over the next 10 years is 13.5 billion, so once again it's very much the lion's share of capital expenditure. We haven't really focused on looking at potentially trying to release value here through a sale of these activities. That would require quite some significant changes in policy around pricing for water, pricing for roads and pricing for stormwater. So we haven't really focused on that. The options that we have looked at within infrastructure is we note that that all these organisations have a significant land that they hold with the purpose that it might be required for future use. The nature of these organisations is that they're not commercially driven, so there are organisational incentives to be quite conservative regarding the judgments that get made around the holding of potential future use land. And we also note that there is very little record kept about what the alternative use value of that land might be. For example, Watercare's got 2,000 odd hectares of forestry up in the northwest. Up in Riverhead, and so we think that one area where a bit more focus could be applied would be a bit more sort of rigorous process around identifying and understanding the alternative value of use of some of that land. As we mentioned before, infrastructure assets are very strong contenders for the use of private sector partnerships, and we encourage that. And the third area is we do suggest that, given that we're looking at $13.5 billion worth of capex over the next 10 years, that if we can find ways where we can see similar levels of service and asset quality maintained, but with marginally lower levels of expenditure, you don't need large savings to create, or large percentage savings to create large absolute savings. And so in our report, we've encouraged the council to look at ways that the private sector could become involved in the asset management plan through various partnership arrangements, and share the savings that get made with council. Community assets. So this is got a book value on the balance sheet of about $8 billion, but again. These are assets that are being valued